forward, we have a 2019 question that reads as, consider the following statements. The Environment Protection Act of 1986 empowers the government of India to, and two statements are given. State the requirement of public participation in the process of environmental protection and the procedure and manner in which it is sought. Lay down the standards for emission or discharge of environmental pollutants from various sources. Which of the statements given above are correct? Now again, few pointers about the Environment Protection Act of 1986. The Act initially, and this is where you will understand which of the statements you can pick. The Act initially came about, we were signing international agreements and everything outside, so obviously we had to implement it in our country. But even before that, there was a major tragedy in our country called as your Bhopal gas tragedy. It's after the Bhopal gas tragedy that we decided we needed some act to overlook certain provisions. Why? Because when the Bhopal gas tragedy happened, it primarily happened because the company that was running the factory over there, they got permissions to run the factory, and they were doing certain provisions, they were doing certain activities over there which were not properly regulated. Okay, so the gas leakage happened, and that is when there were inquiries into it. We found out that we did not have a law in place to punish whoever was working in a unregulated manner. Why? Because see, when you have a factory, when you have any of these chemical related activities happening over there, ideally in all the other countries, what you have is they have certain regulations given. Whatever is your activity, you should not be letting this much of gases out. You should be controlling the level of sewage pollutants. They all have regulations and limitations for it. But in India, we did not have a law to overlook any of this. If you did not have a law, then how will you punish whoever is, has committed this kind of a leakage related activity? So what happened is, it's from that need that it stemmed that we need a proper law to manage these things, and that is when your Environment Protection Act came. So now you tell me, if when the Act is coming from this kind of a philosophy itself, which of these provisions would be correct? I mean, first, let's look into the two statements separately, but the second statement, which reads as, it will lay down the standards for emission or discharge of environmental pollutants from various sources. Won't that statement be correct? Because the Act in itself came for that particular need. So this statement is correct. Okay, now coming to the first statement. The first statement says, the Act states the requirement of public participation in the process of environmental protection and the procedure and manner in which it is sought. Now, this is where you have to understand, when the Act initially came, it gave rise to something called as Environment Impact Assessment and all that. In your Environment Impact Assessment, you do have a provision for your public participation. Okay, but it does not state it as a primary requirement. It does not, it says that in one of these steps you can have your public participation. It's only in that particular thing that this Act tries to even say about it. Now, even when it is there, the procedure and manner in which it is sought is not mentioned in the Act. So the Act, in fact, let's look at it. One of the reasons why the Environment Impact Assessment, now this is a topic that is given in your UPSC syllabus in proper headings, okay, this is very clearly given, but the number of questions that have come from it, it's absolutely close to nil. Why? Because this is not something that is, if you look at the general impact of that also, it is not something that is very it's not happening in a full-fledged manner in our country. So this is also attributed to the fact that the Environmental Protection Act, which gave rise to the Environment Impact Assessment, did not in detail, in proper terms, say what has to be done in it, if not, what will happen. None of these things were spelled out in a clear manner. This is the reason why the first statement is wrong over here. The second statement is correct. The answer to this question is B. Moving forward, we have a 2019 question. The question reads as, under the Ramsar Convention, it is mandatory on the part of the Government of India to protect and conserve all the wetlands in the territory of India. The wetland conservation and management rules were framed by the Government of India based on the recommendations of Ramsar Convention. Third statement, the Wetland Conservation and Management Rules 2010 also encompasses the drainage area and catchment areas of the wetlands as determined by the authority. So now for a brief time, let's go into the Ramsar Convention. The Ramsar Convention was created in 1971 at a site called as Ramsar in Iran. And the idea of Ramsar is to help countries protect its wetlands. How does Ramsar do it? Ramsar has given certain requirements of what can be considered as a wetland. And based on those requirements, Ramsar declares certain wetlands in your country to be, a Ramsar site. Now, this is what they do. Once declared as a Ramsar site, the government tries to take measures to improve it. There is so much of attention given to it because now it is an international site. It's a Ramsar site. Got it. But none of these things are mandatory. The Ramsar Convention cannot come to India and say, why haven't you protected a certain wetland? Why? Because Ramsar is not a legally binding treaty. Not a legally binding treaty. Legally binding means they cannot hold you responsible because certain other treaties are there where if you sign it, it becomes mandatory that you do that provision. So those are called as your legally binding treaties. Ramsar is a non-legally binding treaty, and so your first statement is wrong. It's not mandatory on the part of Government of India. If first is wrong, we are left with only two statements, two options, and we understand that the third is correct. Now coming to the second one, the Wetland Conservation and Management Rules 2010 were framed by the Government of India based on the recommendations of Ramsar. It's quite clear, I just told you, if we are going and signing an international convention, obviously we'll come back to India and we'll create a parallel Indian law because only Indian law has relevance in our territory. So we signed the Ramsar Convention, but later on we are also creating the Wetland Conservation and Management Rules to put those provisions into action in our country. So both 2 and 3 are correct. The answer to this question is 2 and 3 only. Moving forward, we have a question from 2019. The question reads as per the law, the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority exists at both national and state levels. People's participation is mandatory in the compensatory afforestation programs carried out under the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act of 2016. So, there is a new act in place, Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act of 2016. So, now coming to this particular question, I want you to understand the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act was primarily created and it created a management and planning body called as CAMPA. And CAMPA exists both at the national and the state level. And the idea of the CAMPA is primarily, if at all any kind of development is happening in one area, whoever is undertaking that development, the CAMPA management or the management authority will help them assess the value of that or whatever is the degradation that might happen to the environment because of their activity, or whatever is the natural impact created. For example, if it's a forest and I have to clear it and then have to construct some roads over there. So what happens is there is actually you're cutting off the forest, which means that nature has a certain cost. That cost will be determined. And the cost will be paid or should be paid as compensation by that developing authority. That fund or that money which we receive as compensation will go into the public accounts of India. Okay. Now, this is the idea of the act. Nowhere in the act that they are mentioning that public participation is mandatory, because this is primarily to do with the developer and the government. There is not much role of public participation. So, the answer to this question is A. Only the first statement is correct.